Perfect.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, so yeah, I'm just going to briefly talk to you about the construction industry and how the construction industry is kind of shifting its thinking, and how we can contribute to some of these really, really important climate justice issues that we are all facing. So firstly, the bad news, we are facing these really, really huge challenges. So just to sort of talk about this really briefly, the total carbon dioxide emissions that we are emitting is very, very high and continuing to grow globally. And that while we are continuing to kind of increase our renewable energy production, our energy consumption is still much, 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 much higher, and is still continuing to increase. So this is a huge challenge in terms of tackling climate change. We are also impacting on a sort of biodiversity loss, habitat loss, and we're seeing huge kind of losses in biomass, especially in insects, that really, potentially spells disaster for our ecosystems, and we may well be heading towards the 6th mass extinction, or even being at the beginning of that. So these are obviously massive, massive problems. Beyond that, we also are seeing widening inequality in all sorts of, and this is a slide from the US, but sort of just showing how the kind of the proceeds of economic growth over the last few decades have really been unevenly distributed, and that it is the sort of the top 1% or even smaller than that now that have seen the majority of those proceeds, while the bottom 50% have really not seen their income grow at all. So our current extractive take, make, dispose model is really not serving us socially or financially either. And even more thornily, that widening inequality further increases emissions, with the richest 10% globally being responsible for almost half of consumption emissions. So they're sort of massive, massive issues, and they are playing out in a kind of a global scale in a really difficult way, and that that we're seeing that the countries that are least responsible for these emissions and so on are likely to be the most affected, and because of the way that we report emissions on a territorial as opposed to a consumption basis, the sort of the countries that are consuming the most are actually, their carbon footprints are looking artificially smaller than they really are. So this is like a huge, huge, systemic issue. And of course, these are all one large systemic problem. So this is the kind of the wider, very, very briefly, the wider landscape that we're facing. And I think it's really important to recognize that buildings and construction are a key part in this. We are responsible, buildings and construction are responsible for around 40% of emissions. And we continue to kind of pursue an inherently high carbon culture, architecture. The idea of what is beautiful is still kind of quite inherently high carbon, and that's problematic. We need to shift that. And I think we as an industry are starting a little bit more to recognize now, but that that kind of high carbon architecture is not only a problem in terms of carbon emissions, but also in terms of ecosystems more broadly. And this is just one example of the ways that some materials, for example, concrete and steel, contribute to problems with our natural ecosystems. Our property industry, we sort of think in architecture and engineering that we're in a kind of creative industry in many ways, but there are lots and lots of problems with our property industry that we know that is further driving this environmental harm and social problems. So this is just a slide from the UK, but looking at the way that these socially and environmentally unjust developments also proliferate and exacerbate inequality. So sort of housing crises, housing affordability crises, and increasing homelessness and so on. So there are these really important ways that we need to recognise that sort of the built environment industry and the property industry are a part of these wider systemic problems. But enough bad news. The good news is that a transition to a regenerative built environment can really go a long, long way to helping address all of these issues. And it's really important that we play a part. So, for example, having a positive impact on health and well-being, both of workers and of inhabitants of buildings, improving air quality, creating green jobs, speeding up construction times and so on, and things like off-site fabrication. And the timber industry is a really, really critical player in this. improved energy efficiency of our existing homes and tackling fuel poverty and bringing down energy consumption sort of through large retrofit schemes. And this is the sort of energy sprung, the famous project that everybody knows. And again, the timber industry can play a really, really key role in this. And of course, while reducing the emissions associated with building and running buildings is really important, timber buildings are a really fantastic place to store carbon. And here is some carbon I squirreled away in a project I did a couple of years ago, but this is a really, really like one of the key opportunities to store carbon is in timber buildings. So this is really important. Of course, we can, through a shift to a regenerative built environment, we could also help through sustainable forestry and other plans as well, but like sort of sustainable land use. We can help to reverse habitat, to sort of remediate soils and ecosystems, and also displace some harmful industries if the sort of overall ecosystem of our industry is shifting. And I think, you know, overall we need to just think a little bit differently about the line between the built environment and the natural environment, and think of these things more together, rather than sort of in the way this kind of image suggests that we have a built environment that is separate from the natural environment, and sort of within the built environment we need to somehow protect ourselves from kind of, you know, the onslaught of weather and so on, and sort of nature, and in the natural environment we need to protect that natural environment from us. And I think we need to shift that thinking to having a sort of a genuinely kind of a positive relationship, and imagine that positive relationship between our sort of the different aspects of our environment. Yes, and imagine a positive relationship between sort of humans and the rest of nature. And I just find this slide to be really inspiring in terms of a, you know, an interesting and positive relationship. And I think that it's really important when we're talking about timber industry and the circular economy that we are imagining that this positive relationship can exist, and that we can therefore start to implement it and solve some of those really, really huge problems that we're facing today. And just to say that Buro Happold is currently, we're working on some really interesting studies with C40 Studies and with the Aldersgate Group, looking at the benefits of a transition to a clean construction industry, and the benefits of environmental regulation more broadly as well. And those things, those studies are coming out in the next couple of months. So do look out for them, and yeah, their contribution to this conversation. Thank you.